Pressure is inevitable, but misalignment is optional. Today on Transformation Station, we're exploring what it means to stay aligned and supported under pressure. So leaders like you and me can perform with clarity instead of collapsing under the weight. Come on, let's get this conversation started. Welcome back to Transformation Station, the podcast where leadership is strengthened through intention, resilience, and transformation. I'm your host, Adrienne Benton, and today's episode is for every leader who is carrying responsibility, navigating uncertainty, and trying to stay grounded while demands keep coming. Our guest, Loren Richmond, brings powerful insight into how leaders like you and I can remain aligned with our values, supported in our capacity, and steady in our decisions. Let me tell you about our guest today. Loren Richmond Jr. is a ministry consultant, pastor, chaplain, and nonprofit leader, writing and speaking at the intersection of faith, culture, and church renewal. With more than a decade of leadership in churches and community nonprofits, Loren draws from a deep well of lived experiences, both pastoral and practical. And today it is my honor to welcome you, Loren. Welcome to Transformation Station.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Loren, what stands out to me about your work is the way you help leaders recognize that pressure doesn't have to disconnect them. Alignment under pressure is about leading from clarity instead of urgency, and is about building systems. So I want to start off by asking you this important question. When teams are under pressure, from your experience, what are the biggest challenges leaders face in trying to keep everyone aligned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to think about it in this context. So I'm a sports fan, and sports is often, I think, a primary metaphor for me, just because in a billion-dollar business, teams and professional teams just seem to make terrible mistake after terrible mistake in their organizational alignment. And I think
Mm,
it's a good metaphor for even much smaller businesses or organizations. But that pressure to keep things aligned falls away because leaders get emotionally overwhelmed or distracted,
mhm,
and they succumb to external pressure rather than knowing what they really want to be about. I mean, as we're recording this, the NFL season, it's nearing its end, the National Football League, and there's 32 teams, and somehow at least 10 teams have fired their head coach, their executive director, we might say, to use a nonprofit metaphor. And that
mhm.
just, I mean, that's silly, I think, in my opinion. And certainly there's some leaders who need to be replaced, but also like there's not that many good leaders to be to be found, I think. So I think what happens in an Indian corner organization is when folks succumb to external pressure or emotionalism or anxiety, they make decisions that aren't really good in alignment with what they really say they value.
Yeah. So, as you're talking, it reminds me of this. Urgency replaces priorities. In high
Right,
pressure environments, everything starts to feel urgent. And it sounds like what
right.
you're talking about, the NFL and all these coaches being fired. Okay, so there's a high pressure environment, right? They're trying to figure out how are we going to win next season? And so
Right.
urgent is urgent. Let's go ahead and replace the leadership. And some of these decisions for us on the outside, I agree with you. For some of these decisions, it seems like they're just going with the trend and not
Yes.
really thinking it through. And so all of our leaders that are listening and watching right now, as you hear Loren talking with us, we want to invite you to answer this question. Go ahead in the chat right now and just tell us what has been your experience as far as what are some of the biggest challenges that you face in trying to keep your team aligned. And right now we've identified one: urgency replacing priority, right? So Loren, I want to ask you this question. How can clear communication prevent confusion and burnout when pressure is at its highest?
Well, let me respond to that in a way that I think that'll address a follow-up to the first question, in that the best approach that I've heard when it comes to challenging decisions that have some kind of hard deadline is to wait for the last responsible moment. So, obviously, in an NFL team, you want to have some urgency because winning is a priority. In an organization, decisions have to be made. Be clear on what that last responsible moment is. Say, we have to have a decision, or we have to have a product, whatever. We have to have some item or some deadline by this point. Be clear on when that deadline is, when you have that expectation of a decision or a product or what have you. Be clear on
Mhm.
what the last responsible moment is, because if everybody's working from different time frame or expectation, that's really going to add and increase to the anxiety, both from the folks who might be working on it downstream and the higher level leaders.
Mm, I love that. Talk to us a little bit more about that. This is good.
Well, yeah, I just use it. I always use it myself in my own like personal decisions. Like I think about, I mean, I got an email this week about my middle school daughter, whether she wants to go to camp. I have, the decision whether I want to sign my son up for soccer, for youth soccer, right? These are low level decisions, obviously, but I know when is the last responsible moment for me to make a decision by. So
Mm,
for youth soccer, for instance, it's the 31st of this month as we're recording this in January. So I
mhm,
know that I forget whatever the date the 31st is, but I know like I need to make it for my own purposes. I need to make a decision yes, no on the 30th, because if I wait till the 31st, I don't want to risk, forgetting that day and missing out. So for me, that last responsible moment is the 30th. So I set my own mark to say, make a decision by the 30th.
mhm,
Obviously, the soccer or league wants me to make a decision before that. But I know the last moment for me, both in accordance with the deadline, the hard deadline, and my own practices, is the 30th, for instance.
mm. I love that. I love that. So clear communication really is a key for all leaders, right? I mean, if I hear you correctly, having clear communication gives you an opportunity to set goals, to see your left and right limits, your boundaries, to not forget things, right?
Absolutely.
It gives us an opportunity to really set the tone in a way where people can be aligned because we're all moving towards the same goal. I love that. So you've coached both pastors and nonprofit leaders. Tell us, what's the difference between simply surviving ministry and leading it with clarity and peace?
I think it can be so easy to just get into this habit of surviving, of one day after the next. Like we can all do this, whether it's in our organization, whether it's in our personal lives, of just trudging through another day, going to bed and just getting up and trudging through another day. And before we know it, the weekend's here and we use the weekend to catch our breath without any kind of reevaluation or examination of what we're working towards or working for. And I think that's really it, is knowing why we're working and what we're working towards. Obviously, there's gonna be some seasons in life, in our work, where things are a bit drudgery.
Mhm.
I think that's inevitable. Like life is not daisies and roses, but if it's just a constant trudging through, like we really need to try to take stock of, am I working towards my greater purposes and values, both
Mm,
personally and organizationally? And if not, then realignment needs to happen. And again, this is why this is why weekends or downtime is needed,
yeah.
not just to recover, but also to have some time to really think through and reevaluate.
I love that. So let's go back a little bit and kind of unpack surviving ministry and leading with clarity for our leaders that are listening and watching right now. And what I'd like for us to do is let's start with surviving ministry. Lauren, what does that look like? What does it look like? How does somebody know that they are in survival mode? What does that look like?
I mean, I'm laughing because I think through my own examples of noticing when I'm in survival. Some I don't want to share. Uh, they were not healthy behaviors, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
For some I'll share. It's just like your emotional resilience is very low.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's you're exhausted. You're dreading getting out of bed.
Mm-hmm.
So when those moments, you have to have some awareness of what's going on. I'm thinking also just another metaphor for another nonprofit I'm associated with, we use is this idea of a ministry treadmill. So if it feels like you're just trying to keep pace, this constant feeling of I'm not really headed anywhere. I'm just kind of like keeping pace, or even worse, like I feel like I'm holding on for dear life. That's
Mm-hmm.
uh that's a helpful sign to pay attention to.
I love it. I asked the question and I also stopped. I've been in organizational leadership for over 20 years. I was in ministry for about 10 years prior to that. And yeah, that compassion fatigue, that survival
Yes.
mode, it's
Yes.
real. And I found this and wanted to just put this on the screen, right? Surviving ministry looks like reacting to endless needs without a margin. I think
Right.
every pastor, every minister definitely understands that, right? And then feeling responsible for everything and everyone. Mm,
Right.
that's a
Yeah.
that's a whole sermon right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
How have you, as you coach others, others who are in ministry, when you have somebody who, this one in particular, feeling responsible for everything and everyone, what advice do you give them? What encouragement would you give that leader that's looking and listening right now that is wrestling with this in survival mode?
Well, it's so difficult, but it's so important. I think it boils down to really being clear on what's yours and what's not yours. Because, like you said, when we're feeling anxiety, when we're stuck in that urgency cycle, that pressure cycle, everything feels like it's ours and lives and dies based on our efforts alone. Like
Mhm.
it really is important to to dial back. And I mean, so much of this is just being willing to, whatever metaphor we want to use, like take a break, take a breath, take our foot off the gas, like take
Mhm.
a moment to say, like, hey, this is not working. I need to
Mhm.
reevaluate. And then in that space, like, what am I really responsible for? Like even
Mhm.
something, even something like in a church worship service, like the pastor, the worship leader, whatever role someone is serving, like they're not responsible for every item of the worship service. They're not responsible for every outcome. I mean, gosh, as a Christian, I think we would say, like, at some point, like, we can trust the Holy Spirit, right? Like it
Mhm.
really has to come down to that, like trusting that you're not responsible for everything.
I love that. And to the leader that's listening and watching, this last line is key. Survival ministry is often productive, but internally draining.
Yes.
You may be out there looking like the world's biggest wonder, best pastor ever, best leader ever, but if internally you're drained, that's a red flag. You're in survival
Yeah.
mode. And then on the other side of that, let's take a moment and look at leading with clarity and peace. What does that look like, right? So we have this quote here: serving from calling, not from compulsion, prioritizing what God has assigned, not what is merely urgent. What do you think about that, Lauren?
Yeah. I think this is such a challenge too. I mean, as we're recording this, like there's a lot of stuff happening in our world, like especially in our nation. Some really challenging, scary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And this saying that often happens, that I've seen this again and again on social media, is like, oh, if your pastor doesn't say something about something, whatever event, like you need to leave that church. That's an example of an external pressure and urgency all at the same time. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
really important for pastors and leaders to be really dialed in on, what they feel led to do based on their values and purposes, and again, in the church context, where they believe the Spirit is leading them.
Mm-hmm.
Something I think that's helpful is, part of my role is as a hospital chaplain, And in hospital chaplaincy, not solely hospital chaplaincy, other professions do this, but one of my roles as a hospital chaplain has been to help individuals and families prescribe for themselves what's often called a medical power of attorney or medical decision maker, to get specific on who will make decisions for them if they're ever um, unable to make decisions for themselves, and what those decisions will be. Not like at 10 o'clock on a Friday, I want to have my oxygen increased, but more like, if it ever gets to this point, what are my values? Because it's in
Mm,
those really pressing moments, when someone's health is declining rapidly and the crisis response team is descending upon a patient, and the room is kind of in crisis mode, and a loved one is standing there unsure what to do. Having
mm,
those things already prescribed can be a big help. So again, in moments of crisis or organizational challenge, having one's values and goals clearly laid out can be a help, significant help,
mm.
when we're feeling external pressure and uncertainty.
I love that. I love that. And to close this particular question, to those who are listening and watching, all of our leaders, survival mode is fueled by pressure. Peaceful ministry is fueled by purpose. And so we want
Yes.
to invite you to take a moment and do some assessment as you are on your leadership journey, whether you're in ministry or whether you're in corporate organizational leadership. What is your leadership being fueled by right now? Are you in survival mode? If you are, it's okay. Stop, assess, acknowledge it, and begin to turn things around. So, Loren, what are some signs that a church or ministry needs outside help? This can be tough for many ministry leaders, right? And then the
Yeah.
part B is, how can leaders ask for it? This is huge, without feeling like they failed. Hmm.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind around a sign that folks need help is, I think, just like an inability to communicate well, or a feeling of constantly feeling like you're not on the same page, right? Like, it's often, I mean, it's kind of similar to like a marriage or a long-term relationship, where folks just can't communicate well and there's just constant discord. That might be a good sign, like, hey, we need to get someone to help
Mhm.
bring some clarity, or some bring down the anxiety to us. And I think this idea, to the second part of your question, that asking for help is a bad thing, is
Mhm.
frankly a terrible cultural relic of American Christianity. And it's really a shame that it's come to that, this idea that we need to be super
Mhm.
Christians on our own, whether ourselves or a church. Like, Jesus had disciples, he had helpers, folks he sent out in ministry alongside of him. He didn't do
Mhm.
everything alone.
Mhm.
Even in miraculous healings, like, there's times, I'm thinking of the story of the man who received sight. I think, if I'm remembering the story correctly, like, he put
Mhm.
mud on the guy's eyes and said, go wash yourself.
Mhm.
He didn't just click his fingers and say, you're healed. He asked him to participate in some
Yeah.
way. So certainly I think it'd be important to give oneself permission to ask for help. And I think if you're in a context that's not willing to ask for help, if you're the leader and the expectation is you shouldn't ever ask for help, like, I'd frankly be really nervous about being in that context long term as a leader.
Yes, I agree with you 1000%. And another one that I thought about was this: running on empty, or if um, if your leadership team is emotionally exhausted, spiritually depleted, or constantly reactive, capacity has been exceeded. Right? These are some
Yeah.
key signs. Some key signs.
Yep.
And another
Yep.
one that I think many of us wrestle with a lot is our vision sometimes gets blurry or stalled
Yep.
when we feel stuck, unclear, or unable to move forward. An outside perspective can restore clarity and direction. So to every
Yeah.
leader, listen, no man was an island. The Lord allows us to have community. And if you find yourself in a season where you're stalling, vision is blurry, you're running on empty, it's okay to ask for help. Help, asking for help. Lauren, I believe that asking for help means that I'm strong, not that I'm
Yeah.
weak, but
Yeah.
that I'm strong, right? I have the capacity to reach out. I love this. So let me ask you this question. What mindset shifts are necessary for leaders to move forward, or leaders to move toward proactive, purpose driven leadership? What mindset shifts do we need to have?
Certainly, I think hopefulness, and I
Mm,
want to clarify here, especially I believe in a church setting, hope is different than optimism.
mm-hmm,
We're trusting God's promises, not our own.
mm-hmm,
I think also a clarity certainly around, oh, maybe not. Let me rephrase that. Not necessarily clarity, but uh, an ability to kind of tune out the noise, I think is a better way to say that. We can all have our clarity, and then we hear noise and disruption, and we get, you know, I think the one of the most important mindset shifts is to realize like who we're going to listen to and who we're not going to listen to. And certainly I'm of the opinion that I appreciate perspective, I appreciate diverse opinions, but also there's some times where opinions are not helpful, they're distracting. So be clear on like what noise do I need to tune out, and who are my go-to uh, voices for clarity and direction. And especially again when we live in a world where there's so much noise and opinion and distraction.
mm, I love this. So every leader that's listening and watching right now, here in Transformation Station, we take a few moments to kind of stop, pause, reflect on what we're hearing. Lauren is giving us some goodness, some wisdom tonight. And I want to invite you to stop and really collect yourself and get an understanding, get grounded for a moment with an understanding of what is resonating with you and what are you being called to commit to when this podcast is over. So, Lauren, as we move our community forward, we want to ask this question: what practical tools or habits help us as leaders to stay grounded, to stay discerning? And you mentioned that word hopeful earlier, right? And to stay hopeful in the face of discouragement or ministry fatigue. And this is real. Right before you answer the question, I just want to piggyback off of what you said in terms of the times in which we're living right now. There's a verse in the Bible that says, "To whom much is given, much is required." The requirement is
Yeah.
high right now for anyone who is a ministry leader. And I know that there are leaders that are listening and watching right now that are feeling fatigued and they're feeling discouraged. They're in this world. We're going through these situations. What practical tools and habits can you share with us to help us to stay grounded?
I think one simple thing that comes to mind I want to share off the top is just gratefulness. I think there's something really powerful about gratefulness, just
Mm,
the ability of grounding us within ourselves. If
mhm,
we're observing what we have to be thankful for, it's going to diminish feelings of, jealousy or envy or what have you. Like being grateful, I think is important. I'm also
mhm,
thinking like setting intention, being intentional, whether it's with our schedule, with our our efforts. I think intentionality and setting context for ourselves is hugely important. The last
mhm,
thing I'd say is make your goals or efforts small. I think a
mhm,
humongous mistake that happens too far often, broadly speaking, from my context, is everyone wants moonshots. They want to change the world tomorrow. Like
mhm,
change happens slowly, especially with
mhm.
individuals. Uh, do something small and let that confidence build. After one small win, after another small win.
I love that. I love that. And thank you for these practical tips, right? Lauren shared with us gratefulness, right? I love
Yeah.
that. He said, be intentional. That intentionality is so important, and make small steps, make small goals, take one step at a time. These are all doable daily habits that we can put into practice. So, Loren, as we turn the corner on this conversation, I want to ask you this last question. What best practices can organizations adopt to build a culture where people feel supported even when the demands are heavy?
I really think naming reality is one of the most valuable things that can be
Mhm.
done by a leader. Like the last
Mhm.
organization that I worked for a couple of years ago was going through a really challenging season, and the leader, like I was someone who was really battling skepticism, right? I was
Mhm.
battling skepticism and cynicism, and I knew the leader well. I trusted him, and he got up in an all staff meeting and gave this speech, and I knew what he was doing. I knew he was trying to win us over and tell us things were going to be okay, and not so much that things were going to be okay, but that we were all in it together, and he was with us.
Mhm.
But like he named reality. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. He said, "This is gonna be hard, but we can do it together." And just like the
Mhm.
reality of him naming reality and said, "Hey, I'm here with you. We're in this together." Like I was, like I
Mhm.
said, I was cynical and I was skeptical and I was recognizing what he was doing, and I was like, "Oh man, he made a good point."
I love it. So I'm going to put you in the spot here, right? As we end this, I want to invite you to talk to the leader that's listening and that's watching right now that's saying, I want to move into alignment. I want to have clarity as I'm leading in ministry, as I'm leading in my organization. Oh, I just feel stuck. Can you talk to that leader right now, just for a moment before we close?
Yeah, I've been there. Like I think I was just thinking myself like a year or 2 years ago of being my life just feeling stuck, really feeling stuck. So what was really helpful for me was to get really clear on what were my personal values for myself, for my family, like what I really valued. And when I was feeling just lost and unsure, I would always lean into like, does this does this decision does this decision align with one of my values? And if it did, like I just did it. I didn't question it. I just did it. And that was really helpful for me because when we're really in it, when we're really stuck, like nothing feels like the right answer. Like there's one can one can question everything because confusion and unclarity like just run amok. So
Mm,
so just real quick story, like this was a year and a half ago, and I said like my three values were going to be faith, family, and church. So
mm,
as it so happened, my both sets of my parents and my in-laws live in the within driving distance of my family, and I have kids. And my parents were going to be at my in-laws' church on a Sunday evening, and I don't again a church different from my own church. And I realized, this checks all three of my values for me to go and take my kids to see my parents and my in-laws and be in church. Checked all my values. So even though I didn't really feel like leaving the house on a Sunday evening, even though it was a school night, I said, this hits all my three values. I'm going to do it.
mhm. I love it. I love that. All right. So here's the deal. We always invite our guests, we always invite our viewers and our listeners to engage with our guests. How can our viewers and listeners get more of this goodness from you, Loren?
Yeah, thanks for that. So a
Mhm.
few different things. I like to write often on Substack. They can find me at the Church Nerd on Substack. I also have a podcast, Future Christian Podcast, and then of
Yes.
course they can find me on LinkedIn and get a hold of me there too as well.
I love that. I love that. So, to all our listeners and viewers, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and engage with Loren. You see the LinkedIn link on the screen. We'll also have his links in the description box. Go ahead and click on them. Let him know that you saw, that you heard this particular episode, and share with him what has resonated with you. And I know that you have some questions, so be sure to send him some questions so you can grow, because we know the community that learns together grows together. All right, Loren,
Yes.
thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. All right, well, listen. Today's conversation reminds us that leadership under pressure isn't about holding more, it's about holding what matters with clarity and support. And if this episode resonated, I want to invite you to take one moment this week to identify where you feel misaligned or unsupported and choose one small shift that restores stability, a boundary, a conversation, or a pause that brings you back to center. Be sure to share this episode with another leader in your network. Be sure to subscribe to Transformation Station so we can continue building leadership that is grounded, aligned, and sustainable. So until next time, remember, pressure may be a part of the path, but alignment is what keeps you standing strong within it.